That's a pretty widely used one. So we're going to do select star from trips, semicolon, select star from, what were the other ones?
Users.
Users, semicolon. We can keep doing this all day. If there were 50 tables, we can just keep appending all the queries we want.
Select star from flights.
From flights.
And kill the where clause.
Kill the where clause.
Update content length.
Thank you. And we're going to send this.
Ooh.
We missed something. Oops, semicolon.
Is that going to matter?
I don't know.
Well, we can always read the error message. It's verbose.
That's right.
All right, let's see what it is.
What do we get? Okay, it's not flights.
Oh, it's flight. Sorry.
Okay, got our 200 back. Now, here's all the data in the database.
There's the flight data. And then we're actually down here, we see table 1 is starting, and we're actually dealing with, user ID, admin. We're seeing Sam.
It looks like some password hashes.
Chesty LaRue. Eve. So yeah, there's Eve, the debug, and notice debug flag equals true, so we added her to the database. Here's the flight information. So in a single query, we jack the database. So
how long would this have taken us with union select? How much longer than that would it have taken us with blind SQL? And we did it in 2 queries. Now, two requests to the server got us the entire database.
Now, obviously, this is the underlying problem here is SQL injection, right? The only problem is that where you're doing the data binding increases the damage and how quickly you can do damage with the SQL injection vulnerability. So we want to be very clear. I mean, this is kind of an odd edge case. It only works on databases that support chaining of SQL statements.
But actually it expands just beyond SQL.
That's true.
If you're using an XML document as a backend store and you're using maybe XPath or XQuery to query that document, this is very vulnerable to XPath injection attacks. And in fact, XPath injection attacks are even easier to pull off than this one we saw here. Where this one took us all of 2 queries. You can actually fetch the entire XML document with 1 XPath injection attack.
XPath is so much more forgiving of poorly formed statements.
It is much more resilient. So in SQL, if you select a table that doesn't exist or a column that doesn't exist, it will just fail and give you an error. But XPath, if you throw junk into there, it'll just say, well, that doesn't exist, so I'll give you back nothing. So you can say, give me some junk, cat with everything, cat with more junk, and it will just give you everything. Very, very easy. So your whole XPath injection is pipe/*pipe, and that's the entire document.
So again, just this example or this diagram kind of helps things out. What's happening is your SQL injection command is still piggybacking on top, right? That in your traditional app, you normally have to do like a union select to try to basically interface the results from the second query into the query that's already existing in the backend app. Here we're piggybacking, right? I mean, this would work. Even though the results, when the server's trying to format them to XML, it's not actually forwarding the results through. I'm still executing SQL statements. So you could do the whole lovely, you see a site with ASP. I know I always like to do semicolon shutdown with no wait. And then the database, or then the website stops responding, and I'm really glad I'm using my neighbor's wireless connection. So you're still running SQL commands, right? But you can't get the data out because the server's basically quelching it. But when you're binding on the client, the data's still going across the wire. And then JavaScript may suppress it, may put it into a table. Maybe it doesn't. Frankly, I don't care.
Because
it's on the wire.
We've already won at that point. Any smart hacker is going to be listening with a proxy or a proxy tool to see what came over the wire. Now, what are some of the design implementation patterns that lead us to this? A very common one is the use of the ASP.NET dataset. Actually, Microsoft recommends use of the dataset to return query results to the client. And I really hate that for exactly this reason. Dataset, no matter how many tables you fold, or how many select statements you fold into that query, dataset will happily just keep adding more tables and more tables to that dataset. And then when you serialize that to return it to the client, it just gives you everything. It makes it very easy to pull off this kind of attack. Another really common one is the use of the for XML clause in SQL Server. Again, you can keep tacking as much stuff as you want on there, say for XML, just gives it all to you. We talked briefly about XPath, so those are the big ones. Sometimes if you're binding, if you're binding your data by index instead of by name, so in a traditional web application, or if it was binding, if you will, on the server, you'd say this part of the page is record set bracket customer name, record set bracket account number, and you'd be pulling the exact thing you want. Well, if you're voting it by index 0, index 1, there's a better chance that someone's going to be able to inject their own statement into that and take over.
Right. So let's go ahead and move on to the next step. Do you want to talk about symptoms yet?
Yeah, I think we're there.
Okay.
So again, all of this everything we talked about today came from bad advice. So what are our symptoms, if you will, of premature ajaxulation? We talked about sensitive state being stored on the client. We talked about control flow manipulation, exposed administrative functionality, and really not just administrative functionality, but just exposed functionality in general, things you're not supposed to see. And then finally, increased susceptibility to injection attacks.
Now, certainly some of these things, like a lot of people like to say, okay, well, storing secrets on the client, everyone knows you shouldn't do that, right? But before Ajax, you were pretty stupid if you somehow ended up with a database connection string in JavaScript, because JavaScript can talk to a database. So what's it doing there? Normally it was in a comment. Normally it was in something that got left over. Maybe there was a, HTML comment with a username and password. But because JavaScript can play such a more meaningful part in the application now, developers are tripping over these mistakes that we in the security industry have known for a long time are really bad. Because it's so easy. Look at things like Silverlight. I mean, this isn't Ajax, right? But Silverlight is Microsoft's, supposed flash killer. You can write both the client-side part of the code that actually runs inside like a Java applet and the server-side code in C#. The class names are the same. In fact, when you're building it in the little GUI, it's very difficult to figure out which code is going to end up actually compiling and running on the client and which code ends up compiling and running on the server.
Yeah, one of the things we've always said about Ajax is that it adds this additional layer of complexity because you have to have the client and the server, generally running different languages. Not too many people use JavaScript on the server side. So you'd have to know the language conventions of Java or PHP or whatever you're running.
We should tell them this. This was funny. We had one of our customers that we were doing a little review for. They kept having all these weird error messages. They're like, some of our orders aren't coming out right. They were running Cold Fusion on the back end and JavaScript on the front end and doing Ajax calls to Cold Fusion. Well, Cold Fusion uses 1-based indexes. JavaScript uses 0-based indexes. Doesn't really seem, that's kind of a little nuanced. Nobody really cares. The way they implemented their shopping cart, they were actually passing array indexes back and forth. So you could check out and pay for, the 14-carat, cubic zirconia engagement ring, but actually end up with a diamond ring instead. I kid you not. And these are things, right? You would think nobody would do this. But again, when it's on the server and it's all one language, it never really came up.
So then we said, well, wouldn't it be great if you could have the same language on the client and the server? Well, then Microsoft came out with Silverlight, and now basically you can. But all that did was open up a whole different level of stupidity on the developer's part, or let's say ignorance to be kind, because people can't really tell what's executing on the client and what's executing on the server anymore. You see questions in blogs like, how do I access my database from the client, or how do I access the database from the client? Well, you don't. That's insane.
And even if you could, shame on you for wanting to.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is. In some regards, though, it depends on the app, right? Google Gears, I've done a whole lot of work. In fact, Brian and I are going to pimp it later, but we've got an Ajax security book. We've got an entire chapter to offline Ajax apps. These scare the crap out of me. Let me get this straight. You want to write an application that has so much of its business logic in JavaScript that the application works when you're not even talking to the web server? Are you crazy? Not only that, actually, but Google Gears has a local SQLite database that's accessible from JavaScript. So suddenly, client-side input validation is important again. Because when you're in offline mode, you can SQL inject the database, or someone could SQL inject you. Cross-site scripting. If you're not actually performing validation in JavaScript in an offline Ajax app, you actually can have security vulnerabilities, which we never had before because the client couldn't do anything interesting. It was just a dumb terminal with maybe some simple regex checking for a form.
All right, so we may have strayed away a little bit, but yes, it's possible to make good AJAX applications. And we do really, really like AJAX. We think it's got a lot of potential. And I guess we spent the last, hour or so scaring you guys. So let's give a little advice as to what we can do right.
Let's just run through this real quick. Where did we get some of these? AJAX design patterns is very scary. Very cool. Smart guys that wrote it, not too smart on security. This whole concept of having business logic on the client is their fat client design pattern. And in fact, they say things like, don't put business logic on the client. But every one of their examples does it. And a lot of the other things they show you how to do presuppose that you have business logic on the client. So it's like there's either a major communication problem in the AJAX community, or they're just kind of talking out both sides of their mouth. AJAX design patterns, this control flow manipulation, is distributed events. Now, granted, you could do this in a traditional web app, right? Maybe there's a multi-step process, and you're going to go ahead and make a post to step 2 in the process without making a post to step 1. Well, it depends. They might be keeping something on the server that says, well, you can't go to that step, in which case that would stop the AJAX thing too. But you might not be able to even see how many steps there are. At least in AJAX, they give it to me all in JavaScript. I know as soon as I hit this one page, without having to probe around and find out how many steps there are in this process, I know exactly what the control flow is. I know what inputs are used from previous calls and later calls, all of that.
And the other things we already talked about briefly, the single JavaScript library for ease of maintenance, which exposed the administrative functionality, and the ASP.NET AJAX people telling developers to return results in data sets.
So it really comes down to who do you trust on this stuff, right? And we like to say trust us. I'd like to think that we're not complete morons. I mean, sometimes we're kind of silly, but, what resources are you going to use out there? This stuff's 2 years old. We used books. We used blogs. I have for the last 2 times, I'm going out again in September, to speak at this conference called AJAX World, where it feels like I am one speaker out of 70, and I'm on a stage talking about security, and 69 people are talking about how to do the most insecure applications possible. This conference has a magazine, which is a pretty good magazine, AJAX World Magazine. They've got a lot of code snippets and advice about how to build, sexy drag-and-drop shopping carts. So I'm sitting there waiting to give my presentation, and I'm looking through this, and I see, all of their code samples have massive security vulnerabilities in them. And so I get up, introduce myself, and I just start for the first 10 minutes of my presentation. Will you please turn to page 76 in your AJAX World magazine? Look at line 13. This is a file disclosure vulnerability. Here's why. And everybody there, right, all these AJAX developers are like, SQL injection, file disclosure? What is this? Tell us about it. Because, right, we've been able to kind of get some web developers understanding security, but things like Flickr, things like, what was it, Delicious got bought, MySpace got bought for how much? Facebook wants $2 billion. There's so much money in the air. You have people who don't know web security don't know web development, moving into web development. And things like ASP.NET, Java, J2EE, people who have written desktop apps can go, all right, show me the equivalent of a grid view. Now I can write a web app. Yeah, you can't. The security paradigm you use and the way you do things on a desktop app is different for a web app. If you find a file, or if you find a buffer overflow in the find dialog of Word by throwing in 8,000 pipes, no one's going to care. Because it's not remotely accessible. Who would, buffer overflow themselves to run code as themselves? But if I find a buffer overflow in the, spell checking or the, file saving mechanisms of, say, Google Documents and Sheets, I'm running it on the server, and I win. And these people don't understand that.
Another issue, go back. Another issue would be like the frameworks you use. Like hardly anybody actually rolls their own AJAX framework. You're going to just go out and pick one. But now you're kind of at the mercy of that framework, and some are better than others. A good example, I'm not going to pick on them too bad, but the direct web remoting framework has this one feature that it's like a test page for your application. So everything you can do on the server, every API method you've exposed, all you have to do is, if you have the name of the application, just append /DWR to the end, and it takes you to this test page where you can actually just call everything there is to do. Not only is it telling you the complete attack surface of the entire application, it's letting you just exercise it right there in a really convenient